The cold marble floor bit into Clara's knees as she stared at the polished tip of a handcrafted Italian loafer. Above her stood the most dangerous man in New York. The other maids had warned her to stay invisible. At 300 pounds, shrinking into the background was a daily survival tactic. But now, with a shattered whiskey decanter at her feet and the threat of her abusive family looming, she choked out the words that would change everything. "Please don't send me back." At 312 pounds, Clara Higgins didn't just exist in a room. She had to negotiate her space within it. Every movement was a calculated equation of geometry and grace, an ongoing effort to ensure her wide hips didn't clip a hallway table, or her heavy chest didn't brush against a priceless vase. In the sprawling, heavily fortified Alpine, New Jersey estate of Dominic Moretti, clumsiness was not just frowned upon. It was actively punished. The Moretti compound was a fortress disguised as a billionaire's retreat. Iron gates, armed guards in tailored suits, and a perimeter wired with enough security to rival a military base kept the outside world at bay. Inside it was a museum of cold perfection, white marble floors, imported mahogany furniture, and a silence so profound it felt heavy on the lungs. Clara was not supposed to be here. The elite staffing agency that serviced the East Coast's underground royalty usually trafficked in maids who looked like runway models, thin, invisible, and conventionally flawless girls named Chloe or Harper, who could glide through a room without making a sound. Clara was none of those things. She was soft, round, and undeniably fat. Her standard-issue black uniform had to be custom-ordered, the cheap fabric pulling tightly across her broad shoulders and thick thighs, the white apron doing nothing to hide the heavy curve of her stomach. She had gotten the job through a desperate bribe and a stroke of sheer luck. The previous scrub maid had vanished in the middle of the night, a common occurrence in the Moretti household, and the head housekeeper, Mrs. Beatrice Gable, needed a body immediately to scrub the subterranean floors before a major sit-down with the Chicago syndicate. Clara had begged for the off-the-books position. She didn't care about the terrifying rumors surrounding Dominic Moretti. She only cared about the room and board, and the iron gates that would keep her Uncle Arthur from finding her. Arthur Pendleton was a man who smelled perpetually of stale beer and desperation. When Clara's mother died, Arthur took her in, not out of familial love, but to use her inherited life insurance policy to pay off his mounting gambling debts. When the money ran out, Arthur's creditors, a ruthless faction of the Russian mob operating out of Brighton Beach, came knocking. Clara had overheard Arthur making a deal in the kitchen of their dingy Queen's apartment. He was going to hand her over to them. "She's a big girl, sure, but she can work the kitchens in the underground clubs, or worse. She'll work off my debt," Arthur had bargained. Clara had packed a single duffel bag and fled that very night. For 6 months, the Moretti estate had been her sanctuary. Clara survived by being the hardest worker in the house. She took the graveyard shifts, scrubbing the grout in the industrial kitchens with a toothbrush, polishing the grand staircase on her hands and knees until her joints screamed in agony. The physical toll on her heavy body was immense. Her feet swelled, her lower back ached with a fiery intensity, and chafing left her skin raw. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the constant, gnawing anxiety that Arthur would find her. The other staff members were cruel, as people often are when they find someone lower on the food chain. "Careful, Clara," a maid named Jessica sneered one morning in the laundry room, stepping out of the way with exaggerated disgust. "If you trip, you'll bring the whole West Wing down. Mr. Moretti would probably have you shot just for the property damage." Clara kept her head down, her thick, dark hair falling over her flushed, chubby cheeks. "Excuse me, Jessica. I just need the bleach." she murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why Mrs. Gable keeps a fat cow like you around," Jessica muttered, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair. "You ruin the aesthetic of the house." Clara didn't argue. She knew she was an eyesore in this palace of cold perfection. But she also knew that Dominic Moretti, the don of the most powerful Italian crime family on the eastern seaboard, was a ghost. In 6 months, Clara had never actually seen him. He operated in the shadows, leaving for the city before dawn, and returning long after Clara was confined to her tiny servants' quarters in the basement. As long as she stayed out of his way, she was safe. Until the morning the schedule changed. It was a Tuesday, a day Dominic was supposed to be in Manhattan, dealing with the port authorities. Mrs. Gable, a gaunt, terrifying woman with a face like a dried apple and a heart made of flint, handed Clara a silver tray holding a damp microfiber cloth and a small bottle of imported wood polish. "The master's private study," Mrs. Gable barked, her lip curling as she looked Clara up and down. "The usual girl called in sick. I need you to go in there and polish the bookshelves. And Clara, if you so much as breathe too heavily on his things, I will throw you out of those gates myself. Do you understand me?" Clara's heart hammered against her thick ribs. "Yes, Mrs. Gable. I'll be careful. I promise. Just, don't be your usual clumsy self," the housekeeper snapped. "Move slowly. Try to pretend you have some grace." Clara swallowed the humiliation, taking the tray with trembling, dimpled hands. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors to the east wing, approaching the heavy oak doors of Dominic Moretti's study. The air here felt different, colder, charged with an invisible electricity. She pushed the doors open and stepped into the lion's den. The study was magnificent and intimidating, much like the reputation of the man who owned it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound first editions. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, impeccably organized. The faint scent of expensive tobacco, dark roasted coffee, and bergamot lingered in the air. Clara set to work immediately. She knew her size made her clumsy in tight spaces, so she moved with agonizing deliberation. She polished the lower shelves, her knees popping as she squatted down, her breath coming in shallow pants as the tight uniform restricted her diaphragm. She wiped away non-existent dust, desperate to do a perfect job. The problem arose when she reached the top shelves behind the desk. Clara needed the small mahogany step stool kept in the corner of the room. She carried it over, setting it firmly on the Persian rug. She tested it with one heavy foot, ensuring it wouldn't wobble. Satisfied, she stepped up. The stool groaned slightly under her 300 pounds, but it held. She reached up to polish the molding of the shelf. As she stretched, the cheap fabric of her uniform rode up, biting uncomfortably into her thick thighs. She adjusted her weight to pull her skirt down, shifting her center of gravity. It happened in a fraction of a second. The edge of the Persian rug had bunched up under the back leg of the stool. As Clara shifted, the stool tilted backward. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced her chest. Clara flailed her arms to catch her balance. Her thick fingers scrabbled against the bookshelf. She managed to stop herself from falling, her heavy body landing hard on her own 2 feet with a heavy thud that rattled the floorboards. But her wildly swinging right arm had caught the edge of something sitting on the corner of Dominic's desk. Clara watched in slow-motion horror as a bespoke crystal whiskey decanter, a masterpiece of Italian glass-blowing, currently half full of an amber liquid that smelled older than she was, tipped over the edge. Crash! The sound of shattering crystal was deafening in the silent room. Splinters of glass exploded across the polished hardwood floor. and the expensive aged scotch pooled into the priceless Persian rug, staining it a deep, ugly brown. Clara froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She stared at the mess, her chest heaving, her mind short-circuiting. No. No, no, no. Before she could even drop to her knees to try and clean it up with her bare hands, the heavy oak doors flew open. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her face pale, having heard the crash from the hallway. When she saw the broken decanter and the ruined rug, her expression morphed from shock into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You stupid fat cow!" Mrs. Gable shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. She stormed into the room, her sensible heels clicking violently. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That decanter belonged to Mr. Moretti's grandfather. That rug is worth more than your miserable life." Clara dropped to her hands and knees, tears instantly spilling over her thick lashes and streaming down her chubby cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Gable. The stool slipped. I lost my balance. I'll pay for it. Take it out of my wages, please." "Take it out of your wages?" Mrs. Gable laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "You'd have to work here for 100 years to pay for that Scotch alone, you clumsy oaf. I knew I shouldn't have sent a woman of your girth into a room full of fragile things. You are a walking disaster." Clara sobbed, her heavy shoulders shaking as she frantically tried to pick up the shards of glass, cutting her fingertips in the process. Drops of bright red blood mixed with the amber scotch. "Stop it! Leave it!" Mrs. Gable snapped, kicking Clara's thick thigh with the toe of her shoe to get her to stop. "You've done enough damage. Get your things. You're fired. I am calling the transport van right now. They'll drop you back off at whatever Queen's gutter you crawled out of." The words hit Clara harder than a physical blow. Queen's. The gutter. "No," Clara gasped, looking up, her face wet with tears and sweat. "No, please, Mrs. Gable. Don't send me back to Queen's. Please, I'll sleep outside. I'll scrub the driveways with a toothbrush. Please don't fire me." "You are a liability. The van leaves in 10 minutes. Get out of my sight before I have the guards drag you out by your fat hair." Clara couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. If she went back to Queen's, Arthur would find her. The Russians would take her. They would throw her in a basement, force her to work in the trafficking rings, or just kill her to harvest her organs for the debt. She was a dead woman walking. "Please!" Clara wailed, her dignity entirely gone, her large body hunched over the broken glass in sheer desperation. "They'll kill me. If you send me back, my uncle will give me to the Volkoffs. Please!" "I don't care about your pathetic mob fantasies," Mrs. Gable sneered. "She isn't fantasizing, Beatrice." The voice was low. It didn't boom, it didn't shout, but it commanded the immediate, suffocating silence of the room. It was a voice that belonged to a man who decided who lived and who died before he had his morning espresso. Clara froze. Mrs. Gable gasped and spun around, all the colour draining from her face. Standing in the doorway, having bypassed the security detail and slipped into the house completely unnoticed, was Dominic Moretti. Dominic Moretti was a terrifyingly beautiful man. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than a luxury car. His hair was dark, neatly styled but slightly wind-blown, and his jawline looked like it had been chiseled from granite. But it was his eyes that made Clara's heart stop. They were a pale, piercing grey, like the sky just before a blizzard, and completely devoid of warmth. Behind him stood Leo Cavalli, his ruthless underboss, whose hand was resting casually near the bulge of a shoulder holster. Dominic didn't look at Mrs. Gable. His cold grey eyes were fixed entirely on Clara, who was still on her knees amidst the shattered glass and spilled scotch, bleeding from her fingertips, her heavy chest heaving with panicked sobs. "Mr. Moretti," Mrs. Gable stammered, instantly adopting a tone of trembling deference. "I'm so incredibly sorry. You weren't scheduled to return until this evening. This clumsy girl broke your grandfather's decanter. She is completely incompetent. I've already fired her and ordered her removal from the estate." Dominic stepped slowly into the room. His Italian loafers made no sound on the hardwood. He stopped just inches away from the puddle of whiskey. He looked down at the broken crystal. Then he looked at Clara. Clara couldn't look away from his shoes. She was trembling so violently, her whole large frame shook. The terror of the Volkoffs collided with the immediate, visceral terror of the Mafia Don standing over her. "Look at me," Dominic said softly. Clara slowly raised her head. Her face was flushed red, her eyes swollen and terrified. She knew how she looked, a fat, ugly, crying mess bleeding on his expensive rug. "Please," Clara choked out, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. "Please don't send me back." Dominic stared down at her. He didn't blink. He didn't yell. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara felt as though he was looking right through her skin, dissecting her panic, analyzing the truth in her tear-streaked face. Mrs. Gable, misinterpreting the silence as Dominic's mounting rage, stepped forward. "She is a fat, useless pig, Mr. Moretti. I told the agency not to send someone of her proportions. She takes up too much space and ruins everything she touches. She—" "Beatrice!" Dominic interrupted, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. Mrs. Gable snapped her mouth shut. Dominic didn't take his eyes off Clara. "Who is Arthur?" he asked. Clara blinked, fresh tears falling. My uncle," she stuttered, her voice trembling. "Arthur Pendleton. I ran away from him." Leo Cavalli, standing in the doorway, raised an eyebrow. "Arthur Pendleton," Leo said, his rough voice breaking the tension slightly. "The degenerate gambler out of Queens? The one who owes Yuri Volkov 50 grand? Dominic's expression remained entirely impassive, but a dangerous glint sparked in his grey eyes. He knew the Volkovs. They were a thorn in his side, a rival faction trying to encroach on his territory in the ports. "Why are you running from him?" Dominic asked Clara. He was going to sell me to Yuri," Clara sobbed, hugging her thick arms around her heavy waist, trying to make herself smaller. "To pay the debt. He said I was big enough to survive the labor camps they run out of the underground clubs. If I go back, they'll find me. They'll kill me. Please, Mr. Moretti. I'll pay for the glass. I'll work for free for the rest of my life. Just don't make me leave the gates." Mrs. Gable scoffed nervously. "Sir, you can't possibly believe this melodramatic nonsense. She's a clumsy maid trying to save her job." "Leo," Dominic said, never raising his voice. "Yeah, boss. Take Beatrice to the gate. She no longer works here." The room spun. Clara stopped breathing. Mrs. Gable let out a strangled gasp. "Sir! Mr. Moretti, you can't be serious. I have served your family for 20 years. You're firing me over this fat cow." Dominic finally turned his head to look at the housekeeper. The sheer, predatory coldness in his eyes made Mrs. Gable physically take a step back. "You allowed an unauthorized personnel change without my direct approval," Dominic said slowly. "You allowed my sanctuary to be breached by a woman connected to the Volkov syndicate. And worst of all, you are loud, Beatrice. I despise loud people." "But walk her to the gate, Leo," Dominic commanded. "If she speaks again, remove her tongue." Leo grinned, a terrifying, wolfish expression, and grabbed Mrs. Gable by the upper arm. The housekeeper, too terrified to utter another sound, allowed herself to be dragged out of the study, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind them. Clara was alone with the Don. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the execution. He was going to kill her himself. She knew too much. She was connected to his enemies. She had ruined his grandfather's heirloom. "Get up," Dominic said. Clara opened her eyes. She scrambled awkwardly to her feet, her large body aching, her bleeding fingers dripping onto her white apron. She stood before him, head bowed, waiting for the final blow. Dominic stepped closer to her. He was so close she could smell the bergamot and the gunpowder on his clothes. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a pristine white silk handkerchief. To Clara's absolute shock, he reached out, took her thick, shaking hand in his large, scarred one, and began to wrap the silk around her bleeding fingers. His touch was firm, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. "You're a liability, Clara Higgins," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that sent a shiver down her spine. "Having Arthur Pendleton's niece inside my house is dangerous." "I know," Clara whispered, fresh tears threatening to fall. "I'm sorry. I'll go." Dominic tied the handkerchief tight, his knuckles brushing against her soft, dimpled skin. He looked up, his grey eyes locking onto her Wadden. Frightened ones. "You aren't going anywhere," Dominic said softly. "The Volkovs want what belongs to Arthur. But if you belong to me, they cannot touch you." Clara's heart did a violent flip in her chest. "Belong to you? From this moment on, you no longer scrub the floors, Clara. You are my personal maid. You report only to me. You clean only my quarters. And you do not leave my sight." Dominic let go of her hand, stepping back. He looked at the broken decanter, then back at her heavy, soft body, wrapped in the ill-fitting uniform. A strange, unreadable shadow passed over his face. "No one throws my property to the wolves," he murmured. "Not even a clumsy, frightened girl from Queens." He turned and walked toward his desk, leaving Clara standing in the center of the room, her bleeding hand wrapped in his silk handkerchief, realizing with terrifying clarity that she had just traded one monster for another, and this one had no intention of ever letting her go. The transition from the subterranean servants' quarters to the third floor of the Alpine estate felt like ascending to another planet. Leo Cavalli escorted Clara up the grand, sweeping staircase, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick, cream-colored runner. Clara trailed behind him, her bleeding hand still awkwardly wrapped in Dominic's ruined silk handkerchief. She felt hyper-aware of her sheer mass in this pristine environment. Her heavy thighs rubbed together beneath the cheap fabric of her skirt, and her wide hips felt like they might knock over the priceless Ming vases perched on pedestals along the hallway. "In here," Leo grunted, pushing open a set of heavy double doors. Clara stepped inside and stopped dead in her tracks. The suite was larger than the entire Queen's apartment she had shared with Arthur. It was a masterpiece of muted tones, plush velvet, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured grounds and the distant steel-grey line of the Hudson River. A massive king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in heavy silk duvets. "This is a guest room," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I can't sleep in here. The head housekeeper. Beatrice is currently waiting on a bus bench outside the gates," Leo interrupted, leaning against the doorframe and crossing his muscular arms. "You don't answer to the housekeepers anymore, Clara. You answer to the boss, and the boss says you sleep here. The door connects directly to his master suite." Leo pointed a thick finger toward a discreet mahogany door on the far wall. "He wants you close." Clara swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. Why? I'm just a maid, Leo chuckled, though there was no humor in his dark eyes. You think Dominic Moretti claims women just to have them dust his bookshelves? You're under his protection now. Out there, you're a target for Yuri Volkov. In here, you're the Don's property. Get comfortable. The door clicked shut, leaving Clara alone in the terrifying luxury. The next morning, the reality of her new position became frighteningly clear. Clara was not given a bucket or a scrub brush. Instead, at 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak doors opened to reveal an elegant, older woman with a tape measure draped around her neck, followed by 2 assistants carrying garment bags. I am Madame Rossi, the woman announced with a crisp, no-nonsense Italian accent. Mr. Moretti sent for me. Before Clara could protest, she was stripped of her tight, humiliating maid's uniform and forced to stand in her plain cotton underwear in the center of the room. She wrapped her thick arms around her heavy breasts and dimpled stomach, her cheeks burning with intense, hot shame. For her entire life, her size had been something to hide, to apologize for, to compress into shapewear and oversized sweaters. Madame Rossi did not sneer or roll her eyes like the girls at the agency. She looked at Clara with the sharp, calculating eye of an architect surveying a grand, imposing structure. Stop slouching, Cara, Madame Rossi commanded, tapping Clara's rounded shoulder. You are built like a Renaissance painting, yet you fold yourself up like a cheap lawn chair. Stand tall. As the assistants brought out bolts of cashmere, heavy silks and fine wool, the connecting door to the master suite clicked open. Dominic stepped into the room. He was dressed for the city in a bespoke Brioni suit, adjusting his cufflinks. He stopped, his cold grey eyes sweeping over the scene. Clara gasped, immediately trying to cover her large, soft body with her hands, backing up until her heavy thighs hit the edge of the mattress. Mr. Moretti, please, she begged, tears springing to her eyes. I'm not dressed. Dominic didn't. To turn away. His gaze moved over the slope of her wide hips, the thick curve of her thighs, and the soft, heavy swell of her stomach. There was no disgust in his expression. There was only a dark, intense possession that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Madame Rossi, Dominic said, his voice a low rumble. The uniform agency put her in polyester that choked her. I want her in materials that breathe, soft fabrics, deep colors. She is not to wear black. Of course, Don Moretti, the tailor agreed seamlessly. We are focusing on her natural structure. She requires structure and drape. She requires comfort, Dominic corrected sharply. He finally met Clara's terrified eyes. You are my personal maid, Clara. You will represent my household. You will not walk through my halls looking like you are trying to apologize for existing. Do you understand? Yes, sir, she whispered. Good. When they are finished, come to my study. We need to discuss your uncle. 2 hours later, Clara walked down the grand staircase, feeling like an entirely different person. She was wearing a custom-fitted, deep emerald green wrap dress made of heavy stretch crepe. It hugged her large chest securely, cinched at her waist, and flowed elegantly over her wide hips and thick legs. For the first time in her life, her clothes didn't pinch or bind. She didn't look invisible. She looked undeniable. When she entered the study, Dominic was pouring a glass of scotch from a brand-new Baccarat crystal decanter. He didn't look up, but he slid a manila folder across the mahogany desk. Arthur Pendleton was found dead early this morning, Dominic said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. In a cheap motel off the Atlantic City boardwalk, his throat was cut. Clara gripped the back of a leather chair, her knees suddenly weak. Her heavy body swayed, and she sank into the seat before she collapsed. Arthur was dead. The man who had terrorized her, the man who had sold her out, was gone. Yuri Volkov's men did it, Dominic continued, taking a sip of his drink. Arthur owed them 50,000. When he couldn't deliver you as payment, they made an example of him. Which brings us to our current problem, Clara. He walked around the desk, leaning against the edge, towering over her. The Volkov Syndicate operates on a strict code of debt inheritance. In their eyes, you owe them the 50 grand, plus interest. And because Yuri Volkov is a sick, twisted man who runs a trafficking ring out of the port of Newark, he wants you alive. Clara began to shake. I don't have the money. I don't have anything. You have me, Dominic stated plainly. I wired $75,000 to Volkov's offshore account an hour ago. The debt is paid. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Why would you do that for me? I broke your grandfather's decanter. I'm just a clumsy, fat maid. You don't owe me anything. Dominic reached out, his calloused fingers lightly tracing the soft, flushed curve of her jawline. The contrast between his lethal, hardened hands and her soft, dimpled skin was staggering. Because I saw the way you looked at me yesterday, Clara, Dominic murmured, leaning in until she could feel the heat of his breath. You were terrified, but you begged me to save you. You recognized who the real power in this room was. I don't buy things to throw them away, and I certainly don't let Russian street thugs touch what is mine. He withdrew his hand, his demeanor instantly turning back to ice. You are safe within these walls, but you must never, under any circumstances, leave the perimeter of this estate. Yuri Volkov is a proud man. He took my money, but he feels slighted. He will look for a weakness. Clara nodded frantically. I won't leave. I promise. See that you don't, Dominic warned. Because if they take you, Clara, I won't just kill Yuri. I will burn Newark to the ground to get you back. For 3 weeks, the Alpine estate was a gilded cage of terrifying tranquility. Clara settled into her strange new reality. Her duties as Dominic's personal maid were shockingly domestic. She made his espresso in the morning, laid out his suits, and organized the paperwork on his desk. She never saw the dark, violent side of his business, only the immaculate results of it. Her heavy body, once a source of constant physical pain from grueling labor, began to heal. She slept in silk, ate the chef's rich, imported food, and moved with a newfound, quiet dignity in clothes that fit her perfectly. But down in the staff quarters, resentment was festering like an open wound. Jessica Trent, the blonde maid who had constantly tormented Clara, watched Clara's elevation with bitter, poisonous jealousy. Jessica had spent 2 years trying to catch the Don's eye, starving herself, unbuttoning her blouse an extra inch, and perfecting her runway walk. To see a 300-pound girl from Queens suddenly sleeping in the master wing and wearing $1,000 dresses broke something in Jessica's mind. It was a rainy Thursday night when the bubble burst. Dominic was hosting a high-stakes sit-down in the basement war room with the heads of the Lucchese and Gambino families. The security was entirely focused on the perimeter and the lower levels. The upper floors were supposedly secure. Clara was awake at 2 a.m., her anxiety keeping her from sleep. She wore a heavy, dark blue silk robe over her nightgown, her thick, dark hair tied up in a loose bun. Seeking comfort, she quietly padded down the back servants' stairs toward the auxiliary kitchen to warm some milk. She didn't know that 3 hours earlier, Jessica Trent had met a man at the estate's rear delivery gate. A man with a heavy Russian accent who had handed Jessica $10,000 in cash in exchange for the 4-digit code to the kitchen's side service door. As Clara poured milk into a small saucepan, The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the stovetop. A cold draught swept across the marble floor. Clara turned around, her heart stuttering. 2 men stood in the doorway of the pantry. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by ski masks. In their hands, they held suppressed, matte black handguns. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the larger of the 2 men lunged. Clara didn't scream, her throat locked in sheer, primal terror. The man grabbed her by the arm, trying to yank her toward the door. But Clara was not a 100-pound runway model. She was 312 pounds of solid, terrified woman. Instinct kicked in. She dropped her center of gravity, planting her heavy feet firmly onto the floor, pulling back with all her might. The Russian hitman, expecting her to easily fold, lost his footing as he tried to drag her dead weight. He stumbled forward. Clara swung her free arm, her thick, heavy fist connecting squarely with the man's throat. He let out a choked gasp and released her. "Now!" Clara screamed. It was a loud, piercing shriek that shattered the silence of the sleeping house. The second man raised his gun, stepping forward to pistol whip her into submission. Clara backed up, her wide hips slamming into the kitchen island, knocking a heavy cast-iron skillet onto the floor with a deafening crash. "Shut up, you fat bitch!" the second man snarled in heavily accented English, grabbing her by her dark hair and wrenching her head back. Suddenly, the kitchen doors burst open with explosive force. Dominic Moretti stood in the threshold. He had abandoned his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His sleeves rolled up to reveal dark ink snaking up his forearms. In his hand was a custom 1911 pistol. His grey eyes were entirely black with murderous, unhinged rage. The Russian holding Clara's hair didn't even have time to pivot his weapon. Thwip! Thwip! 2 silenced shots hit the man directly in the forehead. Blood and brain matter splattered across the pristine white cabinets. The man collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, releasing Clara. Clara dropped to the floor, her heavy body hitting the marble hard. She scrambled backward, slipping in the pooling blood, her chest heaving in absolute panic. The first Russian, still recovering from Clara's strike to his throat, reached into his jacket for a secondary weapon. Dominic didn't shoot him. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive predatory strides. Dominic grabbed the man by the tactical vest, slammed him into the stainless steel refrigerator, and drove a 6-inch tactical knife straight up under his ribs, piercing his heart. Dominic twisted the blade brutally, then yanked it out. The second body fell to the floor. Silence descended on the kitchen, broken only by Clara's ragged, sobbing breaths. Leo Cavalli and 4 armed guards rushed into the room seconds later, their weapons drawn. Leo took one look at the bodies and cursed in rapid Italian. "Lock down the estate!" Dominic roared, his voice shaking the heavy light fixtures above them. "Find out how they got through the perimeter. If a single rat is found in my house, I want them brought to the courtyard." Leo nodded sharply, gesturing for the guards to drag the bodies out. Dominic dropped his knife on the counter. His white shirt was speckled with blood. He turned slowly toward Clara. She was huddled against the baseboards, her heavy legs pulled up to her chest, trembling violently, her blue silk robe stained with the dead man's blood. Dominic dropped to his knees right in the puddle of blood on the floor. He didn't care about his expensive trousers. He reached out and hauled Clara into his arms. Clara collapsed against his broad chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Her large hands gripped his bloody shirt, burying her face into the crook of his neck. "I've got you," Dominic whispered fiercely, pressing his face into her thick, dark hair. His hands were shaking as they mapped the heavy curves of her back, assuring himself she was whole. "You're safe, I've got you." They came for me, Clara sobbed, her whole large frame quivering. They found me. And they died for it, Dominic growled, kissing the top of her head, a gesture so shockingly tender it made Clara sob harder. Yuri Volkov just signed his own death warrant. He breached my home. He touched my woman. Clara froze, her breath hitching. My woman. Dominic pulled back slightly, forcing her to look at him. His handsome face was splattered with blood, his eyes feral and possessive. "Do you understand me, Clara?" he demanded, his voice thick with adrenaline and dark promise. "You aren't a maid anymore. You never were, not from the moment you looked up at me in that study. You are mine, and I will slaughter anyone who ever tries to make you feel afraid again." He stood up, pulling her heavy body up with him effortlessly, carrying her out of the blood-soaked kitchen and back toward the golden cage of the upper floors, leaving a trail of vengeance in his wake. The Alpine estate was no longer a quiet, gilded sanctuary. It had transformed into a fortress, preparing for war. Within an hour of the kitchen attack, the sprawling grounds were swarming with Dominic's most trusted enforcers. Black SUVs blocked the wrought-iron gates, and men armed with tactical rifles patrolled the manicured gardens. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of strong espresso, cigar smoke, and impending violence. Clara sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed in the master suite, freshly showered and wrapped in a thick, charcoal-grey cashmere sweater that belonged to Dominic. It swallowed her large frame, the expensive wool a stark contrast to the cheap, scratchy uniforms she used to wear. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she held a mug of chamomile tea Leo had brought her. Downstairs, a brutal interrogation was taking place. Dominic had promised her she would never have to see the violence, but the walls of the mansion were not soundproof enough to hide the muffled, terrified shrieking echoing from the basement level. 15 minutes later, the heavy bedroom door opened. Dominic walked in. He had changed into a fresh black tactical shirt and dark denim, stripping away the polished veneer of a billionaire businessman to reveal the ruthless mob boss underneath. His knuckles were bruised, splitting the skin over his right hand. He walked over to Clara, his hardened expression softening the moment his eyes landed on her soft, heavy figure swallowed by his sweater. He knelt in front of her, resting his hands on her wide thighs. "How did they get in?" Clara whispered, her voice rough from crying earlier. "Jessica Trent," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The agency maid who gave you trouble. She was caught by the perimeter guards trying to slip out a service gate with a duffel bag containing $10,000 in cash. She sold the kitchen access codes to Yuri Volkov's men." Clara's breath hitched. She remembered the cruel taunts, the way Jessica had deliberately bumped into her wide hips in the laundry room, the sneers about her weight. But to sell her to the Russian mob? "Is she... Did you—" "She is alive," Dominic said coldly. "For now. I don't spill women's blood in my own home if I can avoid it. But she will never see the light of day again. Leo is transferring her to a shipping container at the Bayonne docks. Let her see how much she likes the cold dark she tried to condemn you to." Clara closed her eyes, a shiver running through her heavy body. She knew she should feel horrified, but a primal protective instinct had awakened inside her. She wasn't the terrified, invisible fat girl from Queens anymore. She was a survivor, and the man kneeling before her was her shield. "What happens now?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet his piercing grey gaze. "Now I end the Volkov syndicate," Dominic stated, his thumb gently stroking the curve of her knee. "Yuri thinks he can strike at the heart of my empire and live. He thinks because he operates out of the shadows in Brighton Beach that I cannot reach him. He is wrong." Dominic stood up, pulling a heavy Kevlar vest from the closet. "I am leaving with Leo and 30 of my best men. The estate is on full lockdown. No one gets in, no one gets out. You stay in this room, Clara. You do not open this door for anyone except me." Panic flared in Clara's chest. She stood up, her heavy bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. She closed the distance between them, her wide hips brushing against his solid frame. She reached up, her soft, dimpled hands grabbing the collar of his tactical shirt. "You have to come back," she demanded, her voice fierce, surprising even herself. "You dragged me out of the dark, Dominic. You don't get to die and leave me alone in it." Dominic's breath caught. He looked down at her flushed, full cheeks, the heavy, beautiful weight of her body pressing against him, and the fierce, undeniable fire in her eyes. This was the woman he had claimed. Not a fragile glass doll, but a woman of substance, resilience, and unyielding strength. He cupped her face in his large, bruised hands, leaning down to crush his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was bruised, desperate, and territorial. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, her thick arms wrapping around his broad shoulders, anchoring him to her. "I will always come back to you, Mia Regina," he murmured against her lips. "My queen." He pulled away, his eyes blazing with a lethal determination. He picked up his customized Sig Sauer, racked the slide, and walked out of the room. The heavy lock clicked securely behind him. Clara was alone, the silence of the room pressing in on her as the engines of a dozen SUVs roared to life outside, carrying the dawn of New York to war. The assault on Yuri Volkov's heavily fortified compound in Brighton Beach was not a quiet assassination. It was an absolute massacre. Dominic Moretti didn't just want to kill Yuri Volkov. He wanted to send a message to every syndicate, cartel, and crew from Boston to Miami. You do not touch what belongs to the Moretti family. For 6 agonizing hours, Clara paced the length of the master suite. Her heavy legs ached, but the anxiety pulsing through her veins made it impossible to sit down. She watched the sun slowly rise over the Hudson River, casting a blood-red glow over the water. The news networks were already reporting a massive gang-related explosion at a warehouse district in Brooklyn, citing multiple casualties and a heavy police presence. Finally, at 8 a.m., the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the silence. Clara practically threw herself at the window. 3 black SUVs, riddled with bullet holes and covered in soot, pulled into the courtyard. Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. The locks on the bedroom door disengaged with a series of sharp clicks. Dominic stood in the doorway. He looked like he had walked through hell. His Kevlar vest was scored with bullet impacts. His face was smeared with ash and dried blood, and he was favoring his left leg, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran to him, her heavy body moving with a sudden, desperate grace. She threw her arms around his waist, burying her face into his chest, uncaring of the blood and dirt transferring onto her sweater. Dominic dropped his weapon to the floor with a loud clatter and wrapped his arms around her wide back, burying his face in her dark hair. He inhaled deeply, the scent of her vanilla soap grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss he had just waded through. "It's done," Dominic rasped, his voice raw and exhausted. "Yuri is dead. His lieutenants are dead. The debt is erased. They will never come for you again." "You're bleeding," Clara said, pulling back and inspecting a deep gash along his temple and the dark stain spreading across the thigh of his jeans. "It's nothing. Scratches," he grunted. "Sit down," Clara ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. Dominic blinked, slightly taken aback by the authoritative tone coming from the woman who, just a month ago, had been sobbing on her knees over a broken decanter. But he obeyed, limping over to the edge of the bed and sitting down heavily. Clara marched into the ensuite bathroom and returned with a first aid kit, warm water, and a stack of clean towels. She knelt between his legs, her thick thighs resting comfortably against the floor. She didn't flinch at the sight of his wounds. She had spent a lifetime surviving the sharp edges of the world. She knew how to clean up the blood. Carefully, her plump, gentle hands wiped away the grime and ash from his face. She applied antiseptic to the cut on his temple, her touch incredibly tender. Dominic watched her, completely mesmerized. He watched the way her heavy breasts pressed against the fabric of the sweater as she leaned in, the soft, beautiful curve of her double chin and the fierce concentration in her dark eyes. "I bought you a ring," Dominic said suddenly, his voice thick in the quiet room. Clara froze, the antiseptic wipe hovering in the air. She looked up at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. "What?" Dominic reached into the pocket of his blood-stained tactical pants. He pulled out a small black velvet box and flipped it open. Inside sat a massive, flawless, emerald-cut diamond, flanked by 2 sapphires, set in heavy platinum. It was a ring meant for royalty, a ring that demanded to be seen. "I bought it 3 days ago," Dominic confessed, his grey eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I was waiting for the right moment. But tonight, when I was standing in that burning warehouse, the only thing I could think about was coming home and putting this on your finger." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling over her thick lashes and rolling down her flushed cheeks. "Dominic, I'm a maid. I'm just a fat girl from Queens who cleans floors. Men like you. You don't marry women like me." Dominic reached out, gripping her soft jawline, his thumb wiping away a tear. "Men like me spend their entire lives surrounded by plastic fake women who would sell my soul for a designer handbag. You fought off an armed Russian hitman to protect my home. You didn't run when you saw the monster I am. You are exactly the woman I need." He took the ring from the box and held her left hand. "You aren't a maid, Clara. You are Clara Moretti. And from this day forward, you run this house. You run this family. Anyone who disrespects you, who looks at you sideways, answers directly to my gun. Will you wear my ring?" Clara looked at the beautiful, terrifying man sitting before her. She thought of her abusive uncle, the cruel maids, the lifelong shame she had carried like a physical weight. All of it was gone, burned away by the Don's dark devotion. "Yes," Clara breathed. Dominic slid the heavy diamond onto her thick finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled her up from the floor, bringing her heavy, soft body onto his lap, kissing her with a desperate, all-consuming passion. 6 months later, the Alpine estate hosted the largest gathering of the East Coast syndicates in a decade. The grand ballroom was filled with made men, politicians and terrifying figures of the underworld. But all eyes were on the top of the grand staircase. Dominic Moretti stood there, dressed in a flawless black tuxedo, looking like the undisputed king of New York. But it was the woman on his arm who commanded the room's absolute silence and respect. Clara wore a custom, deep ruby-red velvet gown that hugged every heavy curve of her body, the fabric draping luxuriously over her wide hips and thick thighs. The massive diamond sparkled on her finger, but it was nothing compared to the confident, radiant fire in her eyes. She no longer tried to shrink herself. She stood tall, her large frame imposing, beautiful and dripping with power. Leo Cavalli stood at the bottom of the stairs, nodding respectfully as she descended. The staff, replaced entirely by professionals who knew better than to ever whisper a wrong word, bowed their heads in deference. Clara Moretti was no longer the invisible maid, begging not to be sent back. She was the immovable queen of the Moretti Empire, and she took up exactly as much space as she pleased. From a terrified, invisible maid scrubbing floors in the shadows to the undeniable and powerful queen of the New York underworld, Clara's journey proves that true strength isn't about shrinking yourself to fit the world. It's about finding the one person who demands you take up space. Dominic didn't just save Clara from the monsters of her past. He gave her the empire she deserved, proving that loyalty and fierce love conquer all. Did you love Clara and Dominic's dark, thrilling romance? Hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more intense, dramatic Mafia romances.